Hello and welcome to the Hetley Stand End podcast. Great to have your company for another edition. Yes, it's the Hetley Stand End podcast, but not as you know it. Today we're launching an exciting spin-off called The Rounds of Our Lives. Yes, each week we will delve deep into the rich history of the Carlton Football Club and look back on a round, a match, or also an event that has played a significant part in the club's 162-year history. And first up, we're looking back at the 2005 Wizard Cup. And gee, wasn't the pre-season cup back then flying? Post the Ansett Cup in 2001, the competition went through a rebrand. It was known as the Wizard Cup. And it was pretty much a tournament that clubs actually wanted to win. The stakes were never going to be as high as the home and away season, but matches were played with a great intensity, greater than the intensity that we see in the pre-season competition of the modern day. In 2004, you had two teams who were on the rise, Geelong and St Kilda. They met in the Wizard Cup Grand Final. It was a fabulous encounter, remembered, of course, for Grant Thomas and Lenny Hayes refusing to show any jubilation in winning the Wizard Cup. They were presented the trophy and refused to smile at the presentation. But footy was fun in the pre-season back then. How on earth have the AFL managed to screw up the pre-season competition from what it was 20 years ago to what it is now? At the moment, we have unofficial match simulations that were played last week. And then going into this week, we have what are the official match simulations, which will be broadcast across KO Sports. And then we also have a lot of in-house match simulations. There's an argument to say that the pre-season matches and pre-season competition lost its appeal because clubs wanted to move a lot of the practice games in-house. But you can't argue that 20, 21, 22 years ago, the crowds for the Wizard Cup were so healthy. There was an interest level, and the matches were played with an incredible intensity for a pre-season competition. So today, in looking back at Carlton's history on Rounds of Our Lives, we're looking back at the 2005 Wizard Cup. By the pre-season of 2005, Dennis Pagan, the two-time North Melbourne Premiership coach, had been in charge of Carlton for 2 full seasons. He took over in 2003 off the back of the salary cap scandal. In 2003, the Blues were just decimated. They finished second last with 4 wins. The Bulldogs took out the wooden spoon. And then you come to 2004, where Dennis Pagan was able to recruit a number of recycled mature players like David Teague, Daniel Harford, Jimmy Morrell, Barnaby French, and Adrian DeLuca. And he somewhat was able to save the ship from sinking for a period of time. The Blues in 2004 finished in 11th position, winning 10 games, a very good result for where the club was during that era. Coming into 2005, there was a quiet sense of optimism that the Blues would be able to build on their 2004 campaign, and Dennis Pagan would be able to really conjure something up with who he had at his disposal. The 2005 pre-season started off with a match against Essendon on February 20. The Blues, their team back then, well, you go through their backline, Brett Thornton and Luke Livingston were the 2 key positions. Off the half backline, Ryan Houlihan, David Teague was playing in a back pocket. Matty Lappin was playing on a wing. Nick Stevens, who had come over from Port Adelaide, was playing in the middle of the ground. Heath Scotland on a wing. The forward line, well, you look back now, pretty potent with Lance Whitnell, Brendan Favola, Jared Waite, a young Jared Waite, a plucky Ian Prendergast, a young Andrew Walker. And then you had Koutafidis as well, who had come back from a couple of knee injuries. The Blues were, what I'll describe as an honest side, not a superstar side, and they played the Bombers in that first round of the Wizard Cup back in 2005. The Blues were able to get off to a pretty reasonable start, leading by 10 points at halftime, but it was in the third term where they kicked away, and at three-quarter time they led by 42 points, and they'd kicked 2 super goals. And you remember the super goals back then, a bit of a fad that they had for the pre-season competition. They were worth 9 points. These are great because you were able to extend the interest levels within a game, because even if your team was 3 or 4 goals down, you knew if they could score a super goal and get a couple on the board, they could peg a few back and try to mount a comeback. The Blues took the honours against an undermanned Essendon side, winning by 37 points in the opening round of the Wizard Cup. Carlton, 2 super goals, 13 normal goals, 11 behinds, 107. Defeated Essendon, 2 super goals, 7 normal goals, 10 behinds, 70. Now, Callum Chambers, in his first game for the Blues after crossing from West Coast, he kicked 2 super goals and a regular goal. Eddie Betts also made an eye-catching debut, kicking 2 goals. Lance Whitnell looking the fittest he'd ever been in a number of years. If you recall back in those times, Lance would always come back to pre-season training unfit, and the club would always have to send him up to Queensland to what they call the Fat Farm. He was looking the fittest he'd been in a number of years and was best of field, kicking 4 regular goals from 15 marks. Nick Stevens, Ryan Houlihan and Matthew Lappin were all prolific through the midfield. Now, if you recall back then, the format of the competition was knockout, so Carlton were able to win their way through to the quarterfinal where they would meet Melbourne on Sunday, February 20th. Carlton kicked the first 3 goals of the match, while the D's could only manage 4 behinds before finally breaking through with the next 2 goals. 2 late goals to the Blues gave them a 15-point lead at quarter time. Come to the second term, Melbourne started well, kicking 3 of the opening 4 goals to draw within 3 points. But Carlton kicked the next 3 goals to lead by 21 points at the major break. A 4-2 third quarter gave the Blues a 31-point lead at the final change, and they looked set for a comfortable victory. But the Demons came back with 6 goals in the final term, including a super goal to trail by just 4 points, though the Blues then steadied and hung on to win by 10 points. Final scores: Carlton 1 super goal, 15 normal goals, 8 behinds, 107. To Melbourne, 1 super goal, 12 normal goals, 16 behinds, 97 in front of 17,249 at Telstra Dome. Once again, Lance Whitnell and Brendan Favola were outstanding up forward, kicking 4 goals each, and they exploited an undermanned Melbourne defence. Whitnell was best on ground once again. Nick Stevens was again very good in the middle of the ground with 24 possessions, while Ryan Houlihan and Matthew Lappin shone. Callum Chambers again showed that he was a worthwhile addition to the Blues with 3 majors, including another super goal, and Luke Livingston did a fine job at fullback to keep David Neitz goalless. A week later, Saturday, March 5, the Blues would meet the Western Bulldogs at Telstra Dome in the Wizard Cup semi-final. Out of 26,039 was in the house to see Carlton blitz the Western Bulldogs, scoring 7-1 in the first quarter to take a commanding 39-point lead at quarter time. The second quarter was more of an even contest, but the Bulldogs were inaccurate, and the margin was 42 points at the major break. In the third term, the Blues kicked 6-2 to extend their lead to 66 points at the final break. In the final term, the game was done and dusted. The Dogs were able to bring the margin back to 51 points, but the Blues had done enough, kicking a mammoth 21 goals in their semi-final to ensure that they would be able to play the Wizard Cup Grand Final at home the week later. At home the week after. Brendan Favola kicked 6 goals, Matthew Lappin kicked 4, and he was also the leading possession getter on the ground with 24 touches. Scott Camporelli and Heath Scotland had 21 disposals apiece. Now, for a club like Carlton, who had been starved for success since the turn of the century after making the 1999 Grand Final, the 2005 Wizard Cup was a high watermark for a Carlton supporter back in the mid-2000s. The atmosphere in the week leading up to the Grand Final for the 2005 Wizard Cup was quite electric. A lot of Blues fans had been starved of success, hadn't seen Carlton in a AFL Grand Final since 1999. The Blues hadn't played finals proper since 2001. To come up against the West Coast Eagles, who were on the rise, they would go on to make the 2005 Grand Final, lose that by 4 points, but also win the 2006 Premiership by a point against the Sydney Swans. And back then, the West Coast Eagles were a stacked unit. They had peak Chris Judd coming off his Brownlow medal year of 2004, Ben Cousins, Chad Fletcher, Michael Gardner, Daniel Kerr, Dean Cox, just absolute stars on every single line of their team. Back then in March, you had the Melbourne Motor Show at the Exhibition Building, you had the Grand Prix, and you had the Wizard Cup. Melbourne was buzzing and the Telstra Dome was rocking. Carlton supporters had turned up to a pre-season grand final in their droves. 43,000 people in the house. After an even first quarter, the Blues took control of the match in the second term, booting 4-1. And you put that down largely to the dominance of Brendan Favola and Lance Whitnell, and the Blues were able to lead by 22 points at half-time. At the other end of the ground, Luke Livingston and Brett Thornton, they were on top of their opponents. The third quarter was even, with both sides kicking 2 goals apiece. until the Eagles kicked a goal right on the three-quarter time siren to bring the margin back to 18 points. When the final term started, Scott Camporeale responded with the first goal of the last, but then the Eagles kicked 4 in a row to take a 1-point lead, and they appeared to have all the momentum. The Blues, they refused to lie down and kicked the next 4, including a 9-pointer from outside 50 by Ian Prendergast, which appeared to put the result beyond doubt. Favola ended up kicking a match-winning 8 goals and was awarded the Michael Tuck Medal for Best of Field. Now, I remember this being a pretty big talking point in the week leading up to the Wizard Cup Grand Final. Nick Stevens had to miss the wedding of his brother to play in the game, and he was superb. Camporeale, he was also great in the midfield. So too Matthew Lappin, Andrew Walker, Ryan Houlihan and Callum Chambers. They all won plenty of the ball too. As I said earlier, coming off a more positive 2004 campaign, the Wizard Cup win was expected to see the return of the club as a force in 2005. The club promptly re-signed coach Dennis Pagan for another 3 years. But come the regular season, success was not to be found for the Blues. In the opening game of the season, Carlton would lose to the Kangaroos by 20 points. They would beat the Bombers by 4 points, and in round 4, they would secure a draw against Port Adelaide. But after that, it was all downhill. The Blues, after winning the 2005 Wizard Cup, would win another award. They would win the Wooden Spoon, finishing last on the ladder. 4 wins, 1 draw and 17 losses to cap off a dreadful year. So there you have it. That is the story of Carlton's 2005 pre-season. Let me know what you think. Should we have the pre-season competition return to the glory days with matches having some sort of a greater intensity, or are you happy with how they're planned out in 2026? Also, don't forget you can nominate a particular round or a season or a player that we can look back on each week on Rounds of Our Lives. But until next time, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Heatley Stand End, and also give us a follow on TikTok and on Instagram. But until next time, I will be back later in the week to wrap up the practice games against Brisbane and Geelong. But until then, go Baggers.